Hi everybody, let's talk a little bit about what's been going on in class. Last week you had a writing assignment on due process and versus crime control. And here's what I really wanted to see you make the connection, was that there was the policing, although organized, the court system wasn't in a particular mode, looking to accomplish societal goals. And the 60s came along and there was a tremendous social upheaval in the United States. And that social upheaval led to the courts becoming active in cases like Escobedo, Miranda, in trying to define police powers. Terry versus Ohio is another famous case that's in there. And what's interesting about Terry is Terry actually is intended by the court to limit the power of the police to only being able to make contact when they have that requisite amount of information. The idea of reasonable suspicion. We're going to beat that to death in a couple of weeks, so I won't start the beating here. But then, as you had the due process era with the court cases that further outlined rights for individuals, including expansion of the Fourth Amendment into the states under MAP, the development of the exclusionary rule. It first started in U.S. versus Weeks, and then that was in 1914, and then it continued to develop and really gain favor as a way to control police misconduct, or at least abuse of the Constitution. So then comes along crack cocaine, just killed the crime rate. Crime rate went sky high, violence, property crimes, just incredible impact on criminality, and up goes crime rate. Now, the response to that was a societal response, that people wanted to live in safety and security. Tons of stuff goes on on the East Coast, especially the development of the broken windows theory, application of the early concepts of community policing, zero tolerance policing, which we still see today, and quite honestly, it's not in that great a favor. But we see several responses. Now we have higher levels of incarceration. And if you think about people that are involved in significant criminal conduct, higher levels of incarceration mean fewer people on the streets to victimize others, or that would victimize others. However, society begins to change, and you start to look at things like AB 109, Prop 47, Prop 57, the restructuring of 3 strikes. I was hoping that you would go and you would see due process, crime control, and then due process again. And the other question then for the really good papers is, what's going to be the result? I'll post Bureau of Justice Statistics, BJS, Bureau of Justice Statistics, information on crime and crime rates, which is interesting when you think about AB 109 and Prop 47, Prop 57, and other societal moves more towards a due process model. So now let's talk about this week. This week is, we're going to talk about different social control, and the early social control, which was the family and any belief system, such as the church, that would cause or create an environment where people would follow rules. And that is, the family and that type of an approach, could be pretty, pretty harsh. There wasn't a whole lot of rules about child abuse. There was what society felt was the appropriate way to handle those problems, and handle problems of their within their family. And those that were within the family were supposed to solve crime problems that were created by other members. Now we bring in the military, and the military began. Here's what the military is there for: is to support whoever's in power. Prior to 1066, just prior to 1066, it was Edward the Confessor, and he would use the military to directly suppress dissent. Then you have a really quick series of military explorations into England by the Norwegians and by William the Conqueror. The Norman invasion, Battle of Hastings, 1066, where actually what had happened was Edward the Confessor was killed in the conflict with the Norwegians, but they're able to push them back out, and then Harold becomes the leader, the King of England. Harold is only a short time because he's killed at the Battle of Hastings. So the Normans get hold, and that was in October. By December, you have a new king. You have William the Conqueror. Now, where we go from there is William the Conqueror has got a whole bunch of problems with people that were the elites prior to the invasion. So what he does is he goes in and uses military force to take their property. Some fled in exile to Europe. But once that was accomplished, he then gave property to certain people and built people that owed him his their living. Now, when that happens, the military steps in and begins to enforce laws, enforce order, and you start to see a normalized system. Really important stuff for you to understand how things move along. Now that gave England a somewhat of a structure of law enforcement. However, that was based on the military model. So you would have some sort of an issue, civil unrest. Military would come in, use military tactics, and suppress the riot. That discussion comes up when you look at the response of the police and then often the National Guard when it comes to civilian riots today. Really interesting. However, in those days, in the days of from 1066 on, for several hundred years, the military would come in and just basically kill people and suppress the dissent that way. Kind of like the scene from Gangs of New York when the military comes in to suppress the rebellion by the Dead Rabbits, by people, the Irish. So that morphs into what I call the commission era of policing. Commission era of policing involves the paying of rewards, people that would recover stolen property, that would identify criminals in specific crimes. So the difficult part is then that became corrupt, and you can see how easily it would be to corrupt people, with that. So You bring in a you bring in a dead guy and say, yep, this is the guy that you want on this particular crime. Give me my reward. And now you have criminals are informing on criminals and a rather large mess. Jonathan Weil is a great example of that commission era of policing. And well, the PowerPoint talks a lot about Jonathan Weil, kind of person to keep in mind in how he was influential. Now, after he was his business was terminated by the government, and he was hung, executed. Then a few years later come along the Fielding brothers, John and Henry Fielding, and they kind of see the business model and they think, well, we could do that, but let's try to do it in a fashion that is not as corrupt. See if we can limit the corruption. So that's what they tried to do with the Bow Street Runners. Bow Street Runners were kind of the first real legitimate investigative service. They did some things that were really important and were innovative for the day. Horse patrol, written crime reports, wanted posters. They did some pretty significant things in that process. So I really want you to pay attention to Jonathan Weil, Fielding's Bow Street Runners, because the Bow Street Runners then lead us into the next era, which is civilian government handling policing. And that starts with kind of a long process. But Robert Peel is the Home Secretary, which is basically Secretary of State. Now, what's the difference is England did not have 300 million people. It was, I don't even know what the population was in England at that time, but it was much smaller. So Home Secretary was, it had slightly different things going on. Peel saw that disorder was a problem, and the public resented the military. So Peel was able to get Parliament to pass the Metropolitan Police Act of 1829. And you're probably going, this has nothing to do with anything. Well, actually it does. In the PowerPoint are Peel's principles for policing. Take a look at those. Think about it for a minute. Compare those to modern policing. What is similar? A rank structure, a central police building, hiring processes, civil service, all the Pendleton Act didn't come around for another 60 years in the U.S., but those issues, are all, every one of those you can overlay just about into American policing, and you can see some of the origin of that. So let's pay super attention to Peel, Maine, Robert Maine, and the attempts to, or how reform happened. And then also take a look at how the Metropolitan Police were not accepted by the public until the Cold Bath Field riots, talked about in the PowerPoint. So, ton of stuff here, really interesting stuff if you are a student of policing. If you're thinking about the police, law enforcement as a career, this might be more for you to ponder, maybe do a little side research on different topics that you might be able to apply or will be able to apply once you get going further in your career and start, you become a manager, and and maybe you start to work within the idea of some innovation. So those are the major topics from this week. You've got a bulletin board this week on the rule of law. Change this around from last semester. Last semester we talked about appeals issues. Rule of law there's several law review articles out there that you could use for reference material when you talk about the two different definitions of rule of law. I think they're interesting and they're incredibly different. Much more different than I really anticipated until I really sat down over the course of a couple of semesters and really started to think about it. And that's what I want you to do, is think about it. Also today, office hours went very well. I had a few people stop in. So Tuesdays, 10 to 11, office hours. Go to the homepage for the course, news items. I'll have a link. You either paste that into your browser or go to that link, and you should be able to get to me. A couple people had problems with their audio and their cameras, so you might have to take a stop by, at least on phone tech support, so you can get some help with that. So that should take care of that. Also, I'm going to do occasional pop-up office hours, so that people that can't stop by Tuesday that are in class might have a chance to do something, or to get in contact with me. I live a little ways from Camp Pendleton, and they're shooting off ordnance today, and that's what that big boom was that you may have just heard. In any event, that'll do us for today. Hey, thanks for your patience, and I will